The chapter opens on a still suburban morning, the kind where sprinklers run on timers and neighbors wave without looking up. A modest single-story home sits at the end of a cul-de-sac in a mid-sized American town. Nothing about the house suggests violence. Nothing about the neighborhood suggests what has already happened inside. The camera of a neighbor's doorbell system captures a boy, 14 years old, backpack slung over one shoulder, stepping off the front porch at 7:42 a.m. He pauses, looks back at the front door, and then, caught in 4 seconds of low-resolution footage that would later become the most-watched clip in the trial, he smiles. Not a nervous smile. Not a sad smile. A slow, deliberate, satisfied smile, the kind that spreads across a face when something has gone exactly according to plan. His name is Caleb Weston. And inside that house, his father was already dying. The outline establishes the central injustice immediately. A child who should have been at school had spent 3 weeks carefully, methodically dosing his father's evening drinks with a substance he had researched on a school computer. The father, Derek Weston, 41, a warehouse supervisor who coached Little League and attended every single one of Caleb's school events, had been complaining of stomach cramps, fatigue, and confusion for nearly a month. 3 different doctors had missed it. His wife thought it was stress. His co-workers thought it was flu season. Caleb knew exactly what it was. Because Caleb was the one causing it. The chapter introduces the then promise, the hook pivot that Grace Tale's format demands. Caleb would go to school that morning. He would take a math test. He would eat lunch with friends and laugh at something on someone's phone. He would come home to find an ambulance in the driveway and tell the paramedics, with tears that arrived exactly on cue, that he had no idea what was wrong with his dad. He would play the role of the frightened son for 11 days. He would play it well. And then the toxicology report would come back, and the world would learn that the frightened son had been the architect of his father's suffering the entire time. The forensic inevitability clue is planted here. A school computer search history. 11 weeks before Derek Weston's first symptoms, a student at Caleb's middle school had searched, how much antifreeze causes kidney failure in adults? How long does ethylene glycol poisoning take to show symptoms? And how to make sweet drinks taste the same. The searches were made during a free period. The login credentials belonged to Caleb Weston. The school's IT department had flagged them at the time and done nothing, a failure that would haunt the district for years. The justice promise closes the chapter. A courtroom 18 months later. A judge with 30 years on the bench. A boy who had spent those 18 months telling anyone who would listen that he was the real victim, of an abusive father, of a broken system, of a world that didn't understand him. The boy would walk into that courtroom still believing he was untouchable. He would walk out in shackles. And the number the judge would read aloud, 85 years, would echo through the courtroom like a gavel-hitting stone. The chapter closes on a sensory detail. The smell of antifreeze is sweet. Chemical. Almost like candy. Derek Weston had told his wife, 3 weeks before he was hospitalized, that his sports drink tasted a little off. She had told him to try a different flavor. He never got the chance. Visual echo. The doorbell footage plays again in slow motion. The smirk. The pause. The turn away. Stories like this remind us that evidence doesn't forget and justice doesn't sleep. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. Derek Weston was the kind of father who kept a whiteboard in the garage. Not for projects or repairs, for Caleb's baseball stats. Every game since Caleb was 7 years old was recorded there in Derek's handwriting. Batting averages, fielding percentages, personal bests. When Caleb quit baseball at 12 to focus on video games, Derek didn't erase the board. He left it there. Told his wife it was just in case Caleb changed his mind. The whiteboard was still there the morning the ambulance came. The chapter builds Derek Weston as a fully realized human being, not a saint, not a perfect father, but a real one. He worked long shifts. He sometimes came home tired and short-tempered. There were arguments. There were moments of frustration that a 14-year-old might interpret as unfairness. But the neighbors, the co-workers, the coaches, and the teachers all described the same man. Someone who showed up. Someone who tried. Someone whose worst documented act of parenting, according to Caleb's own later statements, was confiscating his gaming console for a week after failing grades. This was the man Caleb had decided to kill. The chapter introduces Derek's wife Angela Weston, who would become one of the most important and most heartbreaking witnesses in the trial. Angela is described through her own words in early police interviews, a woman who had noticed her husband's deterioration and blamed herself for not pushing harder for answers. She had made him soup. She had driven him to appointments. She had sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand and praying, while her son sat in the waiting room doing homework. The outline flags this image for later use. Angela's hands in Derek's at the hospital, and Caleb's face 2 rooms away, calm, focused, unbothered. The victim's physical decline is traced here in clinical and emotional parallel. Derek went from a man who could unload a delivery truck in 2 hours to someone who couldn't climb the stairs without resting. His kidneys, under sustained ethylene glycol exposure, were beginning to fail. His neurological symptoms, confusion, slurred speech, tremors, had led one doctor to order tests for early-onset neurological disease. None of them had ordered a toxicology screen for poisoning because no one was looking for poisoning. No one except the one person who knew exactly what was happening and why. The chapter plants the first emotional contrast that will drive audience rage throughout the outline. While Derek deteriorated, Caleb's behavior at school was described by teachers as the best semester he'd had in years. His grades improved. His mood improved. He was more social, more engaged. One teacher noted in her testimony that she had thought something positive had happened at home. She was right. Something had. It just wasn't the something she imagined. A neighbor's memory anchors the empathy beat. 2 months before he was hospitalized, Derek had spent a Saturday morning helping an elderly woman 3 doors down carry groceries inside. He had done it without being asked. Without telling anyone. The neighbor had watched from her window. She described it to the jury during the victim impact phase, and the courtroom had gone completely silent. The whiteboard in the garage becomes the chapter's emotional anchor. When crime scene investigators photographed the Weston home after Caleb's arrest, someone on the forensics team had taken a personal photograph of the whiteboard, off the record, not as evidence, just because they couldn't leave without documenting it. That photograph circulated quietly through the department. It showed Caleb's batting average from age 7, in Derek's careful handwriting, still legible after all those years. Still waiting. Visual echo, the whiteboard. The stats. The handwriting of a man who never stopped believing his son might come back to the game. Before there was a crime scene in the traditional sense. No blood, no weapon, no broken glass. There was a digital crime scene that told the entire story with devastating precision. The outline reconstructs the timeline of Caleb Weston's research across 11 weeks, pulling from school computer logs, a shared family tablet, and a private browser history that Caleb had attempted to delete but had not deleted thoroughly enough. Digital forensics examiner Lena Marsh, who would later testify for 63 minutes straight without a single successful cross-examination challenge, described the search history as one of the most methodical research trails I have encountered in a juvenile case. The chapter maps the research arc. It begins with broad, seemingly curious searches. How does antifreeze work? What happens if you drink antifreeze accidentally? The kind of search a curious kid might make after seeing a warning label. But the searches narrow quickly and purposefully. Within 2 weeks, Caleb was searching for specific lethal thresholds, for the timeline of organ failure, for whether ethylene glycol could be detected in standard blood panels. The outline flags the most chilling search of all, made on a Tuesday afternoon in October. How to make someone sick slowly without them knowing. This was not curiosity. This was planning. The physical evidence of the poisoning itself is reconstructed here. Derek Weston's toxicology report, ordered only after a hospital physician noticed a characteristic calcium oxalate crystal pattern in his urinalysis, revealed ethylene glycol at chronic exposure levels. The pattern indicated repeated small doses over an extended period rather than a single acute ingestion, exactly the kind of administration that leaves no single dramatic moment, no obvious incident, just a slow and invisible accumulation of poison in a body that has no idea it's under attack. The chapter introduces the physical mechanism of the crime. Antifreeze, ethylene glycol, is readily available, inexpensive, and in this case had been purchased at an automotive supply store 2 towns over using cash. Investigators found the receipt in Caleb's backpack, tucked inside a school notebook between 2 pages of math homework. He had kept it. The outline emphasizes this detail for its psychological weight. Keeping the receipt was not carelessness. Forensic psychologists would later debate whether it reflected overconfidence, trophy-keeping behavior, or a subconscious desire to be caught. The jury didn't care about the debate. The receipt was enough. Derek's sports drinks are traced as the delivery mechanism. Caleb had been adding small amounts, carefully measured, according to later analysis of a plastic syringe found beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom, to his father's sports drinks, which Derek kept in a small cooler in the garage and drank throughout the day. The garage was Derek's space. Caleb had learned to move through it invisibly. The syringe still had trace amounts of ethylene glycol on it when investigators found it. The crime scene chapter closes on the kitchen, the ordinary, unremarkable kitchen of a family home where a man had eaten breakfast every morning, where a woman had made soup for a husband she believed was simply ill, and where a boy had gone to the refrigerator every evening and done something that had no ordinary explanation. The kitchen smelled of dish soap and coffee. The crime scene photographs showed cereal boxes on the counter and a child's drawing held to the refrigerator by a magnet. The drawing was Caleb's from when he was 6. It showed a house with a family in front of it. A father, a mother, a small boy, all of them smiling. Visual echo, the refrigerator photograph. The child's drawing. The family that used to be. To understand how a 14-year-old poisons his father over 11 weeks, the outline argues, you have to understand who that 14-year-old had become, and when the transformation happened. Caleb Weston's early childhood is described through school records, teacher interviews, and the testimony of Angela Weston, who would spend 3 days on the witness stand trying to answer the question she could never fully answer. How did she not see it? The psychological portrait that emerges from the chapter is not one of a child who was always violent, always dangerous, always off. It is more unsettling than that. Caleb Weston was, by most accounts, an unremarkable middle schooler until about age 12. Slightly withdrawn, slightly socially awkward, but within any recognizable range of normal adolescent behavior. His grades were average. His friendships were few but stable. He played baseball badly and willingly. He had a dog he loved. He cried at the end of a movie when he was 11 in front of his father, and didn't seem embarrassed about it. The shift is documented with a school counselor's notes from Caleb's 7th grade year. A new counselor, recently hired and methodical about her intake evaluations, had flagged Caleb after a writing assignment in which students were asked to describe a problem in your life. Most students wrote about homework or friend drama. Caleb wrote 4 paragraphs about fairness, about how the world rewarded the wrong people and how people who thought they were in control would eventually discover they weren't. The counselor had noted it as worth monitoring, and had scheduled a follow-up meeting. The follow-up had never happened. Budget cuts had eliminated her position at the end of that semester. The outline introduces the concept of acquired narcissism in adolescence, not as a clinical diagnosis imposed from outside, but as a framework the forensic psychologist would use at trial to describe what the evidence suggested. Caleb had developed a worldview in which he was the protagonist of a story where others were obstacles. His father's authority over him, reasonable, consistent, occasionally firm parental authority, had been reframed in Caleb's internal narrative as persecution. The gaming console confiscation. The mandatory homework hours. The expectations around chores and school attendance. These had become, in Caleb's private accounting, evidence of an oppressor rather than a parent. The most disturbing detail in this chapter is not any single action but a documented pattern. 3 friends who were interviewed after Caleb's arrest each independently described a version of the same conversation. Caleb, in the months before his father's hospitalization, had talked about not having to put up with things much longer. One friend had assumed he meant getting his driver's license. Another had assumed he meant aging out of chores. None of them had imagined what he actually meant. When interviewed, each of them described the same reaction to learning what Caleb had done. Not surprised that he was capable of harm, but surprised at the scale and patience of it. He was always the calmest person in the room, one friend said. That's the part one keep thinking about. The chapter closes on a detail from Caleb's bedroom that investigators found during the search. A handwritten list on notebook paper, tucked under his mattress. The list contained Derek's weekly schedule, what he drank, when, how much, written out with the kind of precision that belongs to scientific observation. The list had been updated regularly. The last update was made 2 days before Derek was hospitalized. Caleb had been tracking the dosage and the symptoms, adjusting as he went, trying to calibrate the decline. It was, forensic psychologist Dr. Raymond Cho would later tell the jury, the most clinical document I have ever seen produced by a juvenile in a domestic homicide case. Visual echo, the notebook list. The handwriting of a 14-year-old tracking his father's destruction in neat, careful print. Derek Weston was admitted to St. Catherine's Regional Hospital on a Tuesday morning in November. His sodium levels were critically low. His kidney function had dropped to 31%. He was confused, in pain, and frightened. A man who had gone to work every day of his adult life suddenly unable to understand what was happening to his own body. He would spend 23 days in the hospital. He would survive, barely, and with permanent kidney damage that would require ongoing management for the rest of his life. And for the first 11 days of his hospitalization before the toxicology screen came back, his son played the role of grieving, worried child with a performance that fooled every adult in his orbit. The outline reconstructs those 11 days in detail, drawing on hospital staff observations, Angela Weston's recollections, and surveillance footage from the hospital corridor. Caleb visited twice. Both visits were captured on camera. In the first visit, he sat beside his father's bed for 20 minutes, holding Derek's hand, appearing to cry. A nurse who witnessed it described him to investigators as a sweet kid, obviously terrified for his dad. In the second visit, 3 days later, Caleb had brought Derek a card, handmade with drawings on it, the kind of thing a much younger child might make. Derek had smiled when he saw it. He had told Angela it meant everything to him. He had no idea his son had spent the previous week researching whether his dosing schedule had been effective. The arrogance is documented most clearly not in dramatic moments but in small, revealing ones. During the first visit, while Derek slept, Caleb asked one of the nurses a question. Had the doctors figured out what was wrong yet? The nurse said they were running tests. Caleb nodded, said, "Okay," and looked back at his father. What the nurse didn't know, and what she would recall with visible distress during her testimony, was that the question had been asked in a tone she now described as almost impatient. Like he was waiting for something. At the time she had read it as anxiety. Later she understood it differently. At school during this period, Caleb's behavior is described by multiple teachers as unusually settled. He turned in every assignment. He participated in class discussions. He helped a classmate with a project. He stayed after school voluntarily to finish a lab report. His English teacher had sent a note home to Angela, later recovered from the family's mail, praising Caleb's sudden academic engagement. Angela had read it at the kitchen table, exhausted from hospital visits, and had cried with relief. She thought the crisis of her husband's illness had finally motivated her son to step up. She had been half right about the connection. The chapter introduces the moment the performance began to crack, not in behavior but in biology. Toxicology results for ethylene glycol are not standard in all poisoning workups. They require a specific order. The physician who eventually ordered the correct test, Dr. Sarah Okafor, a nephrologist called in on Derek's third week of hospitalization, did so because she noticed the calcium oxalate crystal pattern that pointed her toward glycol toxicity. She had ordered the test on a Friday afternoon. Results came back Monday morning. She described her reaction to investigators as a sensation of cold. The numbers were unambiguous. This was not accidental exposure. The chapter closes on the Monday morning Dr. Okafor ordered the police call. Caleb was at school. He was, at that moment, according to his teacher's attendance record, presenting a geography project to his class. He was describing river systems and how they changed the landscape over time, slow, persistent forces reshaping the terrain without any single dramatic event. He received a B+. He was smiling when he sat back down. Visual echo, the hospital corridor camera. Caleb walking away from his father's room. Hands in pockets. Steady pace. Not looking back. Detective Maria Solano had 22 years in law enforcement and had interviewed hundreds of suspects. She would later say in a television interview after the trial, that Caleb Weston was unlike any juvenile she had ever encountered in an interrogation room, not because he was menacing, not because he was wild, but because he was still. She used that word specifically, still. Most kids that age, even innocent ones, they move. They fidget, they cry, they get angry, they shut down. He just sat there and looked at me like we were having a conversation about the weather. The arrest itself is reconstructed in careful detail. Detectives arrived at Caleb's school at 10:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. They had a warrant. They had the toxicology results, the search history, and preliminary confirmation from the digital forensics team about the syringe location, which a warrant to search the Weston home had already yielded that morning. Caleb was pulled from gym class. He was wearing a school t-shirt and basketball shorts. The teacher who witnessed the arrest would describe him to reporters as cooperative. Too cooperative. Like he'd been expecting it. In the car on the way to the juvenile processing center, Caleb said nothing for 14 minutes. Then, according to the arresting officer's report, he asked one question. "Is my dad dead?" The officer told him no. Caleb nodded. Said, "Okay," and looked out the window for the rest of the drive. The officer had noted it as emotionless. The prosecution would later note it differently. It was the question of someone calculating whether a murder charge applied, not the question of a son frightened for his father. The interrogation that followed was conducted in the presence of a court-appointed attorney who had arrived within 40 minutes, and with Angela Weston temporarily excluded at her own request. She had collapsed in the waiting room and was being treated for shock in a separate room. Caleb sat across from Detective Solano and two colleagues and answered every question with variations of, "I don't know what you're talking about," delivered in a tone that several investigators described as bored. He denied the searches. He denied knowing what ethylene glycol was. He denied having any access to the sports drinks in the garage. Each denial was careful, complete, and delivered without hesitation. The chapter introduces the legal dimension that would define the case's trajectory. Because Caleb was 14, the question of juvenile versus adult prosecution became immediate and contested. Prosecutors moved quickly to have him tried as an adult, citing the premeditation evidence, the duration of the crime, and what the state's filing described as a level of deliberation inconsistent with juvenile impulsivity frameworks. Defense attorneys argued equally quickly that the adult system was inappropriate for a child whose psychological development made adult-level culpability an impossibility. The judge assigned to rule on the transfer hearing, the Honorable Patricia Dunmore, was known for methodical, evidence-based decisions and an absolute intolerance for courtroom theater. Angela Weston's first visit to Caleb in juvenile detention is documented here through her own testimony. She described sitting across from her son in a visitation room, looking for something she recognized, and finding the face she knew arranged around something she didn't. She had asked him to tell her the truth. He had told her he didn't know what she meant. She had asked him again, her voice breaking. He had looked at her, she said, like I was the one being unreasonable. She left the visitation room and drove to the hospital and sat in the parking lot for 2 hours before she could go in to see her husband. Visual echo, the visitation room. Angela's reflection in the reinforced glass. Caleb's face on the other side unchanged. Judge Patricia Dunmore's courtroom was not large, but it carried weight. Every attorney who had practiced before her described the same atmosphere. Controlled, precise, and entirely without tolerance for performance. When the transfer hearing for Caleb Weston began, both sides understood they were not arguing about facts. The facts were largely settled. They were arguing about meaning. What does it mean to be 14? What does it mean to plan a crime across 11 weeks? What does it mean to maintain a false performance after the crime is done? And what does the justice system owe a child who behaved, in every measurable way, like an adult calculating the most effective way to destroy someone? The prosecution's transfer argument is laid out here with careful structure. Assistant District Attorney Joel Mercer, the lead prosecutor, presented a three-part framework: premeditation established beyond any juvenile impulsivity threshold, deliberate and sustained deception across an 11-week primary period and 11-day post-crime period, and the intentional research and acquisition of the means of harm. Mercer argued that the juvenile justice system's foundational premise, that young offenders are less culpable because they are less capable of foresight, planning, and consequence reasoning, was directly contradicted by the evidence in this specific case. This was not a moment of rage, Mercer told the judge. This was a semester. The defense's counterargument is treated fairly and in full. Defense attorney Claire Navarro argued that the same evidence the prosecution used to establish adult-level culpability could be read differently, as evidence of a deeply troubled adolescent whose cognitive distortions were precisely the kind of symptom that the juvenile system existed to treat rather than simply punish. She presented preliminary findings from a defense psychological evaluation suggesting a developing personality disorder, trauma responses to a home environment that had been more difficult than the prosecution's portrait suggested, and a brain that was neurologically still 14 years old regardless of what it had done. The chapter's pivot comes in Judge Dunmore's questions during the hearing. The questions she asked of the forensic psychologist, of the detectives, and of the behavioral evidence record. She returned repeatedly to a single data point: the list under the mattress. The dosage tracking document. She asked the forensic psychologist directly whether the level of systematic observation reflected in that document was consistent with any juvenile impulsivity or developmental limitation framework. The psychologist paused. Said that it was, in his opinion, at the outer edge of any such framework. Judge Dunmore wrote something down. Did not look up. Her transfer ruling is delivered in this chapter, 3 weeks after the hearing, in a written opinion that ran 27 pages. The key passage reads, "The court does not transfer this defendant because of the severity of the crime alone. The court transfers this defendant because the evidence demonstrates a capacity for sustained, rational, consequence-aware planning that the juvenile framework does not exist to address." Caleb Weston, 14 years old, would be tried as an adult. Caleb's reaction to the ruling, witnessed by a detention staff member and later described in testimony, was the clearest window into his psychology the record offers before the trial. He was in a common room when his attorney delivered the news. He listened. He nodded. He said, "That's wrong. Not, I'm scared. Not, what happens now. Just, that's wrong." As if the injustice was procedural, not personal. As if the system had made an error in a calculation and he was correcting the record. Then he picked up the book he'd been reading and went back to it. The trial of Caleb Weston opened on a gray March morning 14 months after his arrest. By then Caleb had turned 15. He sat at the defense table in a navy blazer that his attorney had selected, his hair combed, his expression arranged into what multiple observers described as appropriate. He had been coached clearly and thoroughly in how to appear. He appeared attentive when the prosecution spoke. He appeared thoughtful when his attorney objected. He appeared, above all, like a teenager who was taking the proceedings seriously. The jury, 14 people including 2 alternates, watched him carefully during the first days of testimony. They could not see what the court clerk, who had a different angle, could see, that whenever the courtroom shifted its attention away from him, the expression dropped. The attentiveness disappeared. And something else, flatter, emptier, more patient, took its place. Ada Mercer's opening statement is reconstructed in this chapter as a narrative beat rather than a transcript. Mercer had a gift for clarity, not theatrics, not volume but precision. He described the case in a single sentence that he returned to throughout the trial. A man drank from a container that his son had poisoned, and he did this every day for 11 weeks because he trusted his home was safe. He let that sentence sit in the air. He did not embellish it. He did not need to. Navarro's opening is treated with equal weight. She told the jury that they would hear about a child in pain. Not pain that excused what he had done, she was careful to say, but pain that explained it. She described a household with more friction than the prosecution would acknowledge. She described a teenager whose internal world had become distorted in ways no adult around him had recognized or addressed. She asked the jury to hold 2 things at once: that Derek Weston was a victim who deserved justice, and that Caleb Weston was a child who deserved understanding. It was a skillful opening. Several jurors nodded. The first witnesses established the physical evidence architecture. Dr. Okafor's testimony about Derek's medical presentation is detailed, clinical, and devastating. She explains ethylene glycol toxicity with a directness that leaves no ambiguity. Repeated small doses over a sustained period will damage kidneys, nervous system, and ultimately can cause death. Derek Weston survived, she tells the jury, because the diagnosis was made before his organ damage crossed a point of no return. 3 more weeks of the same dosing schedule, she estimates, and the outcome would have been different. The courtroom is silent when she says this. Caleb looks attentive. The chapter's emotional pivot comes when Derek Weston himself takes the stand on the trial's 3rd day. He walks to the witness box slowly. The kidney damage has affected his mobility, his energy, something in the way he moves through the world. He is 42 now. He looks older than that. He sits down. He looks at his son. And Caleb looks back. And for a moment, one long, silent moment that the court reporter would later describe as the longest 5 seconds I have experienced in a courtroom. Father and son hold each other's gaze. Derek's face shows everything: grief, confusion, love that has not been able to turn itself off. Caleb's face shows very little. One juror would later say she made her decision in those 5 seconds. The prosecution's evidence case takes 3 days. The outline maps it as a systematic dismantling of every defense position, not through dramatic confrontation but through the cold accumulation of verifiable fact. Each piece of evidence is presented in sequence, and each one closes another exit for Caleb Weston. The digital forensics, the toxicology, the receipt, the syringe, the dosage list. By the end of the 3rd day, every single one of Caleb's alibis, the ones he had carefully constructed and consistently maintained, had been replaced in the jury's understanding by something the evidence told more clearly. Digital forensics examiner Lena Marsh's testimony runs 3 hours across 2 days. The chapter reconstructs her methodological walk through Caleb's search history in a way that maps like a story: a beginning, general curiosity; a middle, specific planning; and an end, operational precision. She presents the timeline as a visual exhibit, a scrolling document showing search queries with dates and times, and the jury follows it with the attention of people watching something unfold in real time. The searches get more specific, more purposeful, more chilling. A juror in the back row is seen covering her mouth with her hand. The receipt becomes the chapter's most discussed single piece of evidence. A $7.43 purchase, cash at an automotive supply store. Caleb's fingerprints on it. Found in his backpack between 2 pages of homework. The defense argues it proves nothing, that a 14-year-old might have antifreeze-related curiosity without criminal intent. Mercer's response is quiet and direct. He asks Lena Marsh to display the timing of the receipt purchase relative to the first documented search queries. The purchase was made 6 days after the searches began. The timeline speaks for itself. The syringe evidence requires its own beat. The floorboard concealment, a loose board in Caleb's bedroom floor that forensic investigators had found based on a subfloor density scan, is presented through the technician who discovered it. She describes the scan, the removal of the board, the small space beneath, and the plastic syringe wrapped in a plastic bag. The syringe tested positive for ethylene glycol at a concentration consistent with the solution Caleb had been preparing. It had a single partial fingerprint on it. Caleb's. The defense does not effectively challenge this. The dosage tracking list, the handwritten document recovered from under Caleb's mattress, is the final exhibit in the prosecution's physical evidence sequence. A handwriting analyst confirms Caleb as the author. The content is read aloud to the jury by ADA Mercer in full. A clinical accounting of Derek Weston's schedule, his drink habits, the amounts added, the observed symptoms. The jury listens to the whole thing without moving. When Mercer finishes reading and sets the exhibit down, the courtroom is so quiet that the ventilation system is audible. One juror, a retired high school teacher, has been taking notes throughout the trial. She stops taking notes. She sets her pen down. She does not pick it up again. Angela Weston's testimony is the chapter's emotional culmination. She describes in detail that she has clearly rehearsed but that lands with the force of the unrehearsed, finding the list herself after being shown it by detectives. She describes recognizing Derek's schedule in Caleb's handwriting. She describes understanding in that moment that every day she had spent worrying about her husband, every hour in the hospital, every prayer, all of it had been happening alongside something she could not have imagined in her own home, done by someone whose handwriting she had watched develop since he first learned to hold a pencil. She does not look at Caleb during her testimony. Claire Navarro was prepared for the physical evidence. She had expected it, had reviewed it exhaustively, and had built her defense strategy around the psychological and developmental framework rather than the forensic one. What she had not fully anticipated was the degree to which the forensic evidence would make the psychological argument harder to sustain. By the time the prosecution rested, 3 jurors had stopped looking at Caleb entirely. The psychological complexity Navarro needed the jury to hold was becoming increasingly difficult to hold alongside the specificity of what Caleb had actually done. The defense's expert witnesses are presented here with fairness. Dr. Michael Henley, a child psychiatrist with academic credentials and a list of publications, testified about adolescent brain development, the neurological immaturity of the prefrontal cortex in 14-year-olds, and the documented tendency of young people in distress to engage in extreme behavior without fully processing consequences. It was legitimate testimony. It reflected real science. But when ADA Mercer cross-examined Henley, he asked a single question that the chapter identifies as the hinge point of the trial. Dr. Henley, in your professional experience, does adolescent prefrontal immaturity typically manifest as an 11-week dosing schedule maintained with enough consistency to produce a predictable toxicological outcome? Henley's answer, no, that's not typical, was the quietest moment of the trial. And the loudest. The defense's secondary argument, that Derek Weston had been a more difficult and controlling father than the prosecution's portrait suggested, collapses under the weight of the evidence in its own way. Navarro calls 2 witnesses, a former neighbor who describes hearing arguments from the Weston home, and a school counselor who had once noted family stress in Caleb's file. Mercer's cross-examination of both witnesses is brief and surgical. The neighbor acknowledges that she never witnessed violence, never called police, and is describing arguments that occur in most homes. The counselor acknowledges that family stress is a notation applied to approximately 40% of her caseload and carries no specific diagnostic weight. Caleb does not testify. This is presented as a strategic decision. Navarro had made a clear-eyed assessment that putting Caleb on the stand would expose him to cross-examination that his psychological profile made him likely to fail. The jury notices the absence. Post-trial juror interviews would reveal that several of them had wanted to hear Caleb speak in his own voice, not because they needed more evidence, but because they were still, at some level, searching for the child in the story. The silence from the defense table denied them that. Several described it as a kind of answer in itself. The chapter closes on the cross-examination of Caleb's forensic psychologist, the defense's final witness, in which Mercer asks one more question for the jury's consideration. Given everything in the evidence record, was there any forensic psychological framework under which the behavior reflected something other than deliberate, aware, consequence-calculating intent? Dr. Cho answers, the evidence is consistent with a juvenile mind that understood at every stage exactly what it was doing and why. Ada Mercer's closing argument is a work of structured clarity. He does not summarize the evidence in the order it was presented. Instead, he tells the story backward, from the smirk on the doorbell camera to the first search query, walking the jury through every step of the timeline in reverse, so that they arrive at the beginning understanding everything. He closes with a single image, Derek Weston's whiteboard in the garage. He tells the jury he did not plan to use it in closing argument. He had thought it was too sentimental, too much of a reach for emotion. But then he kept returning to it because it was the most accurate document in evidence. It showed what Derek Weston actually was to his son. A father who never stopped keeping score, never stopped waiting for his boy to come back to the game. He had just never known he was playing a different game entirely. Navarro's closing is the most sympathetic version of Caleb's story that the record allows. She does not ask the jury to acquit. She asks them to consider the verdict that fits the whole truth, which she argues includes a child whose suffering was real even if its expression was monstrous. She talks about the school counselor whose position was cut, the follow-up meeting that never happened, the system that noticed something in Caleb's writing in 7th grade and then walked away. She is making an argument about accountability that extends beyond Caleb, about what happens when children fall through cracks and what the jury owes to that larger truth. The chapter traces the jury's deliberation from the outside, what the attorneys did, what the family did, what the world did while 12 people decided. Derek and Angela Weston sat in a small room adjacent to the courtroom and did not speak to reporters and did not look at their phones and did not, according to the family attorney who was with them, speak very much to each other either. They had been living alongside this verdict for 14 months. They just needed the official version. Caleb waited in a holding area adjacent to the courtroom. A detention officer who was present during the wait described him reading the same book he'd been reading at the juvenile center. He was, by the officer's account, 3/4 of the way through it. Deliberations lasted 11 hours across 2 days. On the morning of the second day, the jury sent a note to Judge Dunmore asking for the dosage list to be re-entered as a review exhibit. She granted the request. 37 minutes later, the jury notified the court they had reached a verdict. Visual echo, the jury box, 12 people walking back in. 12 chairs. 12 faces that have already decided. The verdict was read at 10:22 a.m. on a Thursday. The courtroom was at capacity. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. The local news cameras that were permitted in the back recorded what happened in real time, and the footage would be replayed thousands of times in the months and years that followed. What people watched for, what drew them back to the footage again and again, was not the verdict itself. It was Caleb's face when he heard it. On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant. The foreperson paused for the breath that humans take before they change something. Guilty. The chapter describes the courtroom's reaction in waves. Angela Weston made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something in between. Derek Weston's eyes closed. His jaw tightened. He had known intellectually that this was the likely outcome. He had not known how he would feel when he heard it. He would describe it later, in a victim impact statement, as a feeling I don't have words for, something between grief and relief and a kind of love that hurts so much it's almost indistinguishable from something else. The family attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Derek shook his head once, slowly. He was not shaking off comfort. He was trying to clear something. On counts 2 and 3, aggravated battery causing serious bodily harm and criminal conspiracy to commit poisoning, the jury returned the same verdict: guilty, guilty, guilty. 3 times the word filled the room. 3 times Caleb Weston's attorney wrote something down and did not look up. And Caleb. The chapter lingers on this. The footage shows him at the defense table, hands still folded, back still straight. The first guilty lands and he does not move. The second lands and he does not move. The third lands and something changes, not in his posture, not in his expression in any dramatic way, but in the quality of the stillness. It becomes different. The stillness before the verdict had been the stillness of confidence. The stillness after was something else. It was the stillness of someone who has run every calculation and arrived at the wrong answer and is not yet ready to understand why. His eyes move. Just once. He looks at the jury. Not at any individual juror, at the jury as a unit, as an entity, as the thing that has just decided something about him. Then he looks away. Then he looks at nothing. Angela Weston was asked outside the courthouse whether she felt justice had been served. She stood in front of a microphone in the gray March air and said, "I feel like something has been decided. I don't know yet if that's the same thing." It was the most honest answer anyone gave that day. The sentencing hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the verdict. In the intervening time, 3 things happened that the chapter tracks as parallel narratives. Derek Weston's medical team reported that his kidney function, which had partially recovered during the months since his hospitalization, had stabilized at approximately 62%, functional, manageable, but permanently compromised. He would require dietary restrictions and ongoing monitoring for the rest of his life. He was 42 years old. He had, in a real and documented medical sense, a shorter and more limited life ahead of him than he would have had without what his son had done to him. Angela Weston's victim impact statement is given extended treatment in this chapter. She had spent weeks writing it, crossing it out, rewriting it. The final version begins with a memory of Caleb as a small child, a detail so ordinary and loving that the courtroom, which had braced itself for anger, was unprepared for tenderness. She was not speaking in anger, the statement makes clear. She was speaking from a place she could not quite name, a grief that encompassed everyone in the story, including her son, including herself, including the marriage she no longer knew how to exist inside, including the future she had planned and the future that had been replaced with something she was still learning to navigate. Derek's own victim impact statement is shorter and harder. He speaks in plain language about the physical consequences. The pills, the appointments, the fatigue, the days when his body reminds him of what was done to it. Then he speaks about something else. About the night 2 weeks after he came home from the hospital when he had gone to the garage for something and stood in front of the whiteboard with his son's stats on it for a long time. He does not describe what he felt. He says only that he did not erase it. That he hasn't been able to. That he doesn't know what that means. He sits down. The defense presents its pre-sentencing materials, mental health evaluations, testimony about Caleb's behavior in detention, described as cooperative, focused, engaged in education programs, and an argument for a sentence that allows for the possibility of rehabilitation and release. Navarro argues with conviction and skill that the human capacity for change, especially in a young person, must be part of the court's calculus. She is asking the court to leave a door open. The prosecutor's sentencing memorandum runs 41 pages. It documents every piece of evidence, maps the sentencing guidelines, and requests a sentence that reflects what the state characterizes as a crime of extraordinary premeditation, sustained execution, and complete absence of remorse. Mercer notes for the court's consideration that in 11 months of detention, Caleb Weston had not once, in writing, in spoken word, in any documented form, expressed remorse for what he had done to his father. He had expressed frustration with the verdict. He had expressed criticism of the legal process. He had, in one documented conversation with a detention staff member, described Derek's testimony as unfair. He had never said he was sorry. Judge Patricia Dunmore had been on the bench for 31 years. She had sentenced hundreds of defendants. She had read tens of thousands of pages of evidence, testimony, and legal argument. People who knew her professionally described a woman who did not dramatize her decisions, who arrived at conclusions through a process that was systematic, rigorous, and entirely uninterested in the theater of the courtroom. When she sentenced defendants, she explained her reasoning. Not for the cameras, not for history, but because she believed a sentence without explanation was a judgment without accountability. She began with acknowledgement. She acknowledged the defense's arguments about adolescent development and the capacity for change. She acknowledged the genuine complexity of sentencing a 15-year-old, now 15 at sentencing, to a term that would define the entirety of his young adulthood. She acknowledged that the juvenile justice debate is real, the developmental science is real, and that the questions Navarro had raised were not frivolous. She said all of this clearly, fairly, and at length. Then she pivoted. She addressed the remorse question directly. In 31 years, she said, she had encountered defendants of every age, background, and circumstance. She had sentenced people who were clearly guilty and felt genuine sorrow. She had sentenced people who maintained innocence. She had sentenced people who were complicated, who were guilty and sorry and broken all at once. She looked at Caleb Weston. She said, I have reviewed every document in this record. Every interview. Every piece of behavioral evidence. Every note from every detention officer and counselor and staff member who has interacted with you over the course of this case. I have been looking for the moment you registered what you did to your father as something other than an inconvenience to yourself. I have not found it. The sentence, 85 years with the possibility of parole review after 40 years. On the attempted murder count alone, the sentence was 60 years. The aggravated battery counts added additional consecutive time. The conspiracy count added the final years. When Judge Dunmore finished reading the numbers, the courtroom did not erupt. It exhaled. A long, complicated, communal exhale, the sound of a proceeding that had run its course. Caleb's reaction is the chapter's central image. He had been still throughout the sentencing hearing. He had been still through the victim impact statements. He had been still through Mercer's argument and Navarro's argument and the judge's extended reasoning. When she read the number, 85, he turned and looked at his attorney. Navarro's face, carefully composed throughout the trial, showed something it hadn't shown before. Caleb's face showed something too, finally, clearly, without the performance layer. It showed that the number was larger than anything he had calculated. It showed that for the first time in this entire proceeding, the outcome had genuinely surprised him. The smirk was gone. Derek Weston in the gallery had his eyes closed. Angela Weston was holding his hand. The same hands she had held in the hospital. The same hands that had been slowly poisoned in a home that was supposed to be safe. She was holding them tightly. Caleb was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look back. What remains after a verdict like this one is not simple. The outline's final chapter does not pretend otherwise. Justice was served, but justice in cases like this one does not restore what was taken, does not unpoison the sports drinks, does not give back the kidney function, does not repair the marriage that buckled under the weight of what happened to it, does not answer the question Angela Weston asked herself every day for years afterward. What did I miss and when could I have changed it? Derek Weston's life after the trial is documented through a single interview he gave 2 years after sentencing, to a journalist working on a piece about juvenile crime and the adult justice system. He described learning to live inside a body that had been betrayed, not by age or disease, but by someone who had known exactly what he was doing. He described the garage and the whiteboard and the decision he finally made about it. He had painted over it. Not right away. Not in anger. About 18 months after the verdict, on a Saturday morning when he felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, he was careful to say, not anything he had a clean name for, but a readiness to stop measuring. He painted the whiteboard white. He stood in the garage afterward for a long time. Angela Weston's story is told here with care and without resolution, because her story did not resolve cleanly. She and Derek separated 2 years after the trial. Not from hatred, from the weight of trying to be the same people they had been before, inside a life that the crime had permanently changed. She described it as 2 people who loved each other very much, trying to find the version of the future they could actually live in. She moved to a different city. She started working with a nonprofit that supported families of juvenile offenders. She did not speak publicly about Caleb's case after the initial coverage faded. She did not stop thinking about it. Caleb Weston, at the time of the outline's final beat, is serving his sentence. His first parole review is decades away. His attorney filed an appeal that was denied. A second appeal is pending on the transfer ruling. Claire Navarro, who left the public defender's office 2 years after the trial, has said in interviews that she still thinks about the case, that she believes both things simultaneously, that Caleb Weston committed a terrible crime, and that the system that produced him failed him at several key moments, and that holding both of those things at once is not comfortable but is necessary. What the chapter resolves is the moral architecture. The smirk on the doorbell camera. The doorbell footage that plays at the beginning of every documentary clip, every news segment, every discussion of this case. That 4-second image of a 14-year-old who thought he was walking away clean. He was not walking away clean. The calcium oxalate crystals in his father's urinalysis were already forming the evidence that would unmake every calculation he had made. The school computer logs were already sitting on a server. The receipt was already in his backpack. The syringe was already under the floorboard. The dosage list was already written. Everything he had done was already there, waiting to be found, because evidence does not accommodate arrogance. It simply waits. The chapter closes on Derek Weston's description of the first morning after he painted over the whiteboard. He had woken up early the way he always did. He had made coffee. He had walked out to the garage and stood in front of the white expanse where the numbers used to be. And he had felt, for the first time in longer than he could trace, Something that was almost like the morning before all of this happened. Not the same. Never the same. But adjacent to it. Close enough to breathe. He had gone back inside. Made breakfast. Sat at his kitchen table. And let the morning be what it was. A morning. Returned to him, slowly and imperfectly, by the long, patient work of the truth. Final visual echo, the white garage wall. The empty space where the numbers used to be. Morning light on painted over wood. If you believe that evidence always finds the truth and that no one, regardless of age, is above accountability, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.